So the Ruike P801-SF in Sandvix 14C 28N blade steel. So we're going to run this through the toughness test or performance test and see how this steel holds up to everything. And you're probably wondering why I chose to go with this random budget steel for my second performance test, and there's a very specific reason for it. It's due to an experience that I had several months ago that really shed a new light on the steel for me personally. I ended up actually having to open some cans of food with this knife, about 4 or 5 cans, and when I did it at the time, it had a halfway sharpened edge on it. It had a really coarse grit edge finish on there, as well as a pretty large size burr. And before I started cutting the cans open, I was really expecting the knife to come out on the other end with some pretty significant, at least at the bare minimum, some rolls and maybe some light chipping. And so I went ahead and opened all the cans, washed the knife off when I was done, and took a look at it. And to my surprise, it didn't really cause very much damage at all. The only thing it really did was kind of just dull the edge out. It didn't cause any major rolling, didn't cause any chips, and that really impressed me. And it got me started on a track of thinking about how this steel has performed for me over the years, and I couldn't think of a bad experience that I had with it. I'd always been pretty pleased with the edge retention, although it's not phenomenal. It's pretty good for a budget steel on a $28 knife, which is what this is. I know that it's extremely corrosion resistant. One of the most corrosion resistant steels on the market, short of something like LC200N, something that's completely stainless. It's really high up there in that department. And then the toughness, I wasn't really sure of. I just kind of have always had it in my mind that stainless steels are not tough, and that's just the way I've always looked at them. And after I cut open those cans, it really kind of changed my opinion on the steel overall. So that's essentially the reason that I really wanted to test this steel at, just because I've been intrigued by it ever since I had to do that with those cans. So getting into it here, going through the 16 gauge speaker wire, cutting 10 pieces by hand, and then batoning through 10 pieces as well. Went right through the wire, no issues. Pretty easy to cut through and baton through. I may eventually change the size wire or the type of wire that I'm using for these. I may get something a little more difficult to deal with if this doesn't prove effective at damaging any blades at all. So made it through the wire, everything was good, didn't really change anything. Moving on to these thick zip ties, kind of sideways cutting through them, putting a lot of lateral pressure on the edge as I do, as well as on the pivot and the blade. Check the edge, everything's still good to go. Now we're gonna baton through it about 10 times as well. And zip ties are something that you hear people say damages some of the higher end stainless steels, or at least that I've heard people say that before. I've never personally experienced it, but that's the reason it's in this test, if you're wondering, is because I have heard of people getting chips from cutting zip ties. So I got the thickest, toughest zip ties I could find to use during these tests, and we'll see if it over the next several tests if it damages anything. I don't think it's going to cause any issues for steels of this toughness rating like 14C28N, but maybe for something like S110V, that'll be a different story. So, made it through the zip ties, pretty much the same thing as the K390, hasn't caused any problems at all up until this point. We're still basically at the same level of sharpness, maybe slightly less from the wire at the end of the blade. That'll show up at the end of the test, but I don't think the zip ties caused any issues. It definitely was still cleanly slicing through the paper all the way through to the end of the tip. Pretty much just like it was before I started. So, fixing to move on to the wood here. And this piece of wood that I have is, like I said in the other test, it's a very hard, dense piece of wood. It's actually from a shrub, I believe. And it's basically the hardest piece of wood around my house that I could find. So that's the reason I'm using that. I'm not sure exactly what type of wood it is, but I know that it's harder than anything else I could find. So digging into it again with the lateral pressure, just kind of chewing in there sideways, digging in, rocking the blade back and forth to see if it can cause any kind of damage, and just really digging in there for a good little while. Check the edge. No damage. No shiny spots, no blunting. Check the paper. Still slicing cleanly. And now to the edge smacks. Did about 30 of those. Check for the damage. No issues again. And this is that knife is wearing an edge from a medium Spyderco ceramic stone and stropped on a 4 micron. It's pretty much what I'm going to do all these tests to, is around that 800 grit mark with a 4 micron strop on basswood. Every steel I test is going to be sharpened just like that. I feel like that's a good, push cut level of sharpness, and it'll be a decent mid-range for every steel, and just easy for me to get done quickly. So, did some spine wax. The lock held up really well, which I was kind of worried about given the fact that this is a $28 knife, but it did really well. It didn't cause any stick, no blade play, no issues at all. And now we're stabbing into the copper block, as you can see, and I'm stabbing it pretty hard. You can see I stabbed it so hard there it stuck it completely in there, and was able to pick the block up just lifting the knife up. So I didn't break the tip like it did on the K390. Didn't cause no issues at all on that little run there, but stay tuned. Now we're just digging into it, cutting, shaving material off the corners, cutting over top of where I've chopped the corner before with the Endura. And on a brittle stainless steel like M390, that would probably cause some chipping. Cutting over those little chatter marks and making it jump across the edge like that would more than likely at least take a small chip out of something like M390. But for this steel, it didn't cause any problems. No problems at all. So, pretty impressed with the performance so far. Slice through the paper, still perfectly clean. Stabbing through the top of the can, and I'm stabbing pretty hard. I'm going a good ½ inch or so through the top of the can. Didn't break the tip, didn't cause many issues, although at this point the last ½ inch of blade or so is starting to get a little dull, or duller than it was when we started. It's starting to catch on the paper there, and you can see it starting to slow down up there a little bit. But the tip's still fully intact. And I think there's a little tiny light reflection off of the close to the end of the blade there. So now we're gonna pry open the paint can or putty can. Did it relatively easy, and I knocked it down in there pretty tight. And it didn't cause any chips that time. I think it exacerbated the dullness a little bit, because that tip area is slowing down in its level of sharpness now. But that's pretty much everything that we did, and it held up extremely well. Oh, wait, no, we got the some more edge smacks. And I'm hitting this up against there pretty hard as I feel comfortable with. Not worrying to chop the knife into my thumb or something, which is a good bit of force. So now I'm going to lay it down and chop it on the flat part. I know you guys can't hear it, but I'm using a lot of force to do this with, and you can see the grooves in it. I'll hold it up to the light there. You can see it, how deep they are. And it's still cleanly slicing through the paper. And this is where I screwed up, because I was so impressed with it. I decided to jab the tip in that copper block as hard as I possibly could to get it to stay in there, and then I let the knife go. And I guess when I did, it leaned over and broke that tip off. So that's what I get for trying to show it off. And that's pretty much the end of the test, guys. Pretty impressed with the performance. If it wasn't for me trying to show off at the end, there was literally no damage, no rolling, no chipping, just a light bit of dulling the last ½ inch of blade or so, and that was pretty much all it did to it. And after this, I did a final sharpness test with a piece of receipt paper, and we'll talk about the steel for a second while we go through this. So, like I said originally, I had had this steel on my mind for a while, and that's why I decided to do this one as my second test. And I really was thinking that this was the best steel on the market, or budget steel at least. And I guess I was sort of out to prove that to myself. And as I made this video and was, doing a little bit of research on the steel, I came across an article from knifesteelnerds.com, and they did a write-up on trying to determine what the best budget stainless steel was on the market. And you guys can go read it. It's a great article. It's got a lot of information in there. But ultimately, the conclusion that they came to was that 14C28N had the greatest combination of all three attributes of corrosion resistance, edge retention, and impact toughness, and they consider this to be the best budget stainless steel on the market. So it basically proved my suspicions that was the case. That's kind of what I was thinking, or at least how I felt about the steel after I used it to open those cans. And they just sort of proved my assumptions for me. So that was a really cool thing to be right about it. And I'm definitely very impressed with the steel. And it seems like most companies are running the hardness to, between like 56 and 59. And it's capable, according to Sandvik, of a hardness of 62. So maybe they could run it even a little bit harder, even if it reduced the toughness a little bit, but improved the edge retention, then it would be even more phenomenal, because you've got some room there at 30 foot-pounds where you could lose a little bit of toughness, I think, and still be okay. So overall, I'm extremely pleased with this steel and impressed with it, and I would love to see more manufacturers use it, other than Kershaw and Rake here, and Real Steel I think uses it, but I'd love to see it on Civivis and a lot of other budget steels on the market. I think it deserves more of a platform than it actually gets nowadays. So thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed and found it useful, and we'll see you next time.